Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. Gabriel Moreau lay dying in the merciless Arizona sun, his blood seeping into sand that had drunk the life from countless men before him. The 3 bullets in his chest burned like brands, each breath a struggle against the inevitable darkness that crept in from the edges of his vision. His horse was gone, his water was gone, and the men who'd ambushed him had taken his guns along with the bounty money he'd spent 6 months earning. This was how legends died, not in glorious gunfights, but alone and forgotten in the vast emptiness of the desert. The betrayal still stung worse than his wounds. Jake Morrison had been his partner for 3 years, splitting bounties and watching each other's backs through dangers that would have killed lesser men. But greed had poisoned their partnership, and when the reward for the Sandoval brothers had reached $10,000, Morrison had decided he preferred the money to friendship. The ambush had been perfectly planned, Gabriel isolated, outnumbered, and left for dead, while his former partner rode away with their prey and all the gold. Vultures circled overhead like harbingers of doom, their shadows passing over his broken body as they waited for him to stop moving. Gabriel had always imagined death would come quickly in his line of work, a bullet through the heart during a fair fight, perhaps, or a knife in the back from someone who couldn't face him honestly. Instead, it was coming slowly, painfully, giving him time to contemplate every mistake that had led him to this moment of abandonment and betrayal. The sound of wagon wheels cutting through the desert silence made him wonder if delirium was setting in, but the creaking grew louder and more distinct as whatever was approaching drew nearer. Gabriel tried to call out, but his voice emerged as little more than a whisper that the wind immediately stole away. He could only lie there, helpless as a newborn, as the mysterious traveler decided whether he was worth saving or just another piece of desert debris to be avoided. When a woman's face appeared above him, framed by the harsh blue sky like a vision from heaven, Gabriel wondered if he'd already died, and this was his judgment. She was beautiful in the way frontier women could be, weathered by hardship but unbroken, with eyes that held depths of suffering he recognized from his own mirror. "Hold on, stranger," she said softly, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of New Orleans refinement somehow transplanted to this godless wilderness. "I'm getting you out of here." As gentle hands began examining his wounds with surprising skill, Gabriel realized that death might not claim him today after all, but salvation often came with a price that could prove even more dangerous than dying alone in the desert. 6 months earlier, Marguerite Dubois had stood beside her husband's grave and made a promise she was already beginning to regret. Henri had been a good man, gentle, hard-working, devoted to building their small ranch into something that could sustain a family through the harsh realities of frontier life. His death from pneumonia had left her with debts she couldn't pay, land she couldn't work alone, and responsibilities that seemed to multiply like desert weeds after rain. The bank wanted their mortgage payment. The hired hands had drifted away to find employers who could actually pay wages, and the cattle were scattered across territory too vast for one woman to manage. The neighboring ranchers had made their intentions clear, with offers that weren't really offers at all. They would buy her land for a fraction of its value, or she could marry one of their sons and let a man handle what they considered man's work. Their condescension was wrapped in frontier courtesy, but the underlying message was unmistakable. A woman alone was a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. Some had been more direct in their propositions, suggesting arrangements that would solve her financial problems while satisfying needs they assumed every widow must have. Marguerite had considered their offers for exactly as long as it took to understand what accepting would mean, the end of everything Henri had worked to build, the loss of the independence she'd fought to maintain, and the surrender of dreams that had brought them west in the first place. She'd rather fail on her own terms than succeed by accepting charity that came with chains attached. The decision to stay and fight for what was hers had felt noble at the time, but 6 months of struggling against impossible odds had worn down her resolve like water eroding stone. The isolation was the worst part, days that passed without hearing another human voice, nights that stretched endlessly while she listened for sounds that might mean danger or relief. Henri had been her companion, her advisor, her partner in every decision, and without him, even simple choices felt overwhelming. Should she sell the cattle now or wait for better prices that might never come? Should she plant crops she might not be able to harvest or focus on making improvements that required money she didn't have? Every path forward seemed to lead toward failure. The morning she'd hitched her wagon to ride into town for supplies she couldn't afford, Marguerite had been planning to stop at the bank and surrender the deed to her land. 6 months of struggle had taught her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and accepting defeat seemed preferable to the slow starvation that was her only alternative. But finding Gabriel bleeding in the desert had changed everything. Suddenly, she had something more immediate than her own problems to focus on, a life that needed saving regardless of what it might cost her. Sometimes, she would later realize, the best way to save yourself was to save someone else first. Marguerite's small ranch house became a field hospital as she fought to keep Gabriel alive through the first critical night. The bullets had to come out, but she had no medical training beyond what frontier life had taught her about treating injured animals and family members. Her hands shook as she heated Henri's old knife in the fire, knowing that what she was about to attempt could just as easily kill the man she was trying to save. But leaving the bullets in would certainly kill him. So she had no choice but to try. Gabriel drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, his body burning with fever while she probed for lead fragments that had lodged near vital organs. Each time he cried out in pain, Marguerite felt her resolve waver, but she forced herself to continue. Henri had always said that mercy sometimes required cruelty, that saving someone often meant hurting them first. She'd never understood what he meant until now, as she caused agony in the desperate hope of preventing death. The first bullet came out easily enough, lodged in the muscle of his shoulder, where it had done more damage to his mobility than his life. The second required careful digging through flesh that had already begun to heal improperly, and Gabriel's screams echoed through the small house like accusations against her amateur surgery. But it was the third bullet, lodged dangerously near his heart, that nearly broke her nerve entirely. One wrong move could kill him instantly, but leaving it alone would certainly kill him slowly. When she finally extracted the last piece of lead, Gabriel had passed out from blood loss and pain, his breathing so shallow she had to lean close to make sure he was still alive. Marguerite bandaged his wounds with cloth torn from her own petticoats, then spent the rest of the night alternating between cooling his fever with wet rags and forcing liquids between his unconscious lips. She'd saved injured animals before, but this was different. This was a human being whose life depended entirely on her inexperienced hands. Dawn found her sitting beside his bed, exhausted but cautiously hopeful, as his breathing grew stronger and his fever began to break. Gabriel's eyes opened for the first time since the surgery, focusing on her face with confusion that gradually gave way to understanding. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice rough but clear. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but Marguerite found herself answering with honesty that surprised them both. "Because saving you felt like the first right thing I've done since my husband died." As Gabriel's strength slowly returned over the following weeks, Marguerite began to understand exactly what kind of man she'd rescued from the desert. His clothes were expensive but practical, cut for someone who valued quality over appearance. His guns, when he was well enough to clean them, were the tools of a professional, maintained with the care that meant the difference between life and death in his line of work. Most telling of all were the scars that covered his body like a map of violence, each mark telling a story of danger survived and enemies overcome. "Bounty hunter," Gabriel admitted when she finally worked up the courage to ask directly. "Been tracking outlaws for 8 years, bringing them in for the rewards posted on their heads. It's dangerous work, but it pays well, and someone has to do it." His explanation was matter of fact, but Marguerite caught the defensive tone that suggested he'd justified his profession to himself and others more times than he cared to remember. There was shame mixed with pride in his voice, the complex emotions of a man who did necessary work that polite society preferred to ignore. The revelation changed everything about how Marguerite saw her guest, transforming him from mysterious stranger to dangerous professional whose very presence could bring trouble to her isolated ranch. Bounty hunters made enemies, not just among the criminals they pursued, but among the families and friends of men they'd brought to justice. Every person Gabriel had captured or killed had left behind people who might consider revenge a reasonable response to their loss, and harboring him could make her a target for violence she was utterly unprepared to face. But understanding his profession also explained the skills he'd displayed during his recovery, the way he positioned himself to watch all approaches to the house, the automatic way his hand moved toward his weapons when unexpected sounds broke the silence, the hypervigilance that never fully allowed him to relax even when safe among friends. Gabriel lived in a world where trust was a luxury that could get you killed, where every stranger might be an enemy in disguise, where survival depended on never dropping your guard completely. Despite her growing concern about the danger his presence might bring, Marguerite found herself reluctant to ask Gabriel to leave once he was well enough to travel. Partly it was gratitude for the way he'd helped with ranch work during his recovery, handling tasks that had been beyond her strength and abilities. But mostly it was the simple pleasure of having another human being to talk with, someone who could share the burden of daily survival and the comfort of evening conversations. For the first time since Henri's death, she wasn't completely alone, and that was worth almost any risk. As Gabriel grew stronger and began talking about moving on, Marguerite realized she was falling in love with a man whose life was dedicated to violence, and the knowledge terrified her more than any outlaw ever could. Gabriel's offer to stay and help with the ranch work came just as Marguerite was preparing to accept defeat and sell her land to the bank. His presence had already made an enormous difference. Fences that had been broken for months were suddenly repaired, cattle that had wandered were gathered and properly managed, and improvements that had seemed impossible with her limited resources were accomplished through his knowledge and physical strength. More importantly, his reputation as a dangerous man had kept away the neighboring ranchers who'd been circling like vultures, waiting for her to collapse so they could claim her property. "I need time to heal properly," Gabriel explained when she protested that she couldn't afford to pay him wages. "And you need help that I can provide. We can make this work for both of us. I'll handle the heavy labor and security. You provide room and board while I recover my full strength. When spring comes and I'm ready to get back to bounty hunting, we'll settle accounts fairly." His proposal made sense from a practical standpoint, but Marguerite sensed deeper motivations that he wasn't ready to discuss. The arrangement transformed both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Gabriel discovered that ranch work provided a peace he'd never found in the violent world of bounty hunting. There was satisfaction in building rather than destroying, in nurturing life rather than ending it. Marguerite found that having a partner who respected her intelligence and capabilities was completely different from the condescending offers she'd received from other men. They worked together as equals, each contributing skills the other lacked. Their evening conversations became the highlight of both their days, with discussions that ranged from practical ranch management to philosophical questions about justice, morality, and the price of survival on the frontier. Gabriel's stories of tracking criminals revealed a man who struggled with the ethical complexities of his profession, while Marguerite's memories of life with Henri showed a woman who valued partnership over dominance in relationships. They were learning to trust each other with thoughts and feelings neither had shared with anyone else. But the growing intimacy between them also created new tensions and complications that neither was prepared to address directly. Gabriel's past was filled with violence that could follow him anywhere, making any personal relationship a potential liability for everyone involved. Marguerite's future remained uncertain. The ranch was stable for now, but long-term survival would require resources and planning beyond what either of them could provide alone. As winter deepened around their isolated homestead, both began to realize that their temporary arrangement was becoming something neither had intended, but both were reluctant to examine too closely. The partnership was working, but partnerships could be dangerous when they started feeling like something more personal and permanent. The first blizzard hit 3 weeks before Christmas, trapping Gabriel and Marguerite together in the small ranch house, while snow piled against the windows and wind howled like lost souls across the prairie. The storm's fury was beautiful and terrifying, reminding them both how small and vulnerable they were against the raw power of nature unleashed. Gabriel spent hours maintaining the fire that was their only defense against freezing temperatures, while Marguerite rationed their supplies with the careful precision of someone who understood that survival depended on making everything last until spring. The enforced intimacy of the storm broke down barriers that had been carefully maintained during the warmer months when outdoor work provided natural separation and distraction. Now they were confined to the same small space, sharing meals across a table that seemed to shrink with each passing day, sleeping in rooms separated only by a thin wooden wall that couldn't muffle the sounds of restless movement or occasional nightmares. The professional distance they'd tried to maintain dissolved in the face of shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. Gabriel's nightmares were the worst part. Violent dreams that left him crying out in languages Marguerite didn't recognize while his body fought battles that existed only in his sleeping mind. When she finally worked up the courage to wake him during one particularly brutal episode, she found him trembling with remembered terror, his face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. "I've killed so many men," he whispered against her shoulder as she held him like a frightened child. "Sometimes I can't remember their faces, just their eyes when they realized they were going to die." The confession opened floodgates that had been sealed for years, and Gabriel found himself telling Marguerite about the weight of taking lives, even when those lives belonged to men who deserved death according to the law. He spoke of the families destroyed by his actions, the children left fatherless by his bullets, the communities that celebrated his arrival even as they feared what his presence meant. Bounty hunting had made him wealthy and respected, but it had also made him a collector of guilt that grew heavier with each successful hunt. Marguerite listened without judgment, understanding that Gabriel was trusting her with parts of himself he'd never shared with anyone else. In return, she found herself confessing her own fears and failures, the loneliness that had nearly driven her to accept marriage proposals from men she didn't love, the moments of despair when suicide had seemed preferable to continued struggle, the guilt she felt over being unable to save Henri from the illness that had claimed him. Their confessions became a form of intimacy more profound than any physical connection, two wounded souls finding healing in shared honesty. As the storm raged outside their small sanctuary, Gabriel and Marguerite discovered that love could grow even in the darkest circumstances, nurtured by trust and understanding rather than passion and desire. The three riders appeared on the horizon just after dawn, black silhouettes against snow that reflected the early morning sun like scattered diamonds. Gabriel spotted them first. his trained eyes recognizing the purposeful way they approached, not the random movement of travelers or the casual pace of neighbors, but the deliberate advance of men with specific business to conduct. His hand moved automatically to his gun, while his mind calculated distances, cover, and the odds of protecting Marguerite against professional killers who'd finally tracked him down. "Morrison," Gabriel breathed, recognizing the lead rider despite the months that had passed since their partnership had ended in betrayal and attempted murder. His former partner had grown soft during his time spent enjoying stolen bounty money. But the men flanking him carried themselves with the deadly competence of hired guns. They'd come not just to finish what they'd started in the desert, but to eliminate the witness who could identify Morrison as a murderer and thief. Marguerite saw the fear in Gabriel's eyes and understood immediately that their peaceful winter sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. "Who are they?" she asked quietly, already moving to gather weapons and supplies with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned that panic was a luxury frontier life couldn't afford. Her question carried no accusation, only the practical need to understand what they were facing so they could respond appropriately. "My former partner, and the men he hired to clean up loose ends," Gabriel replied, checking his weapons with movements that had become automatic through years of preparing for violence. "Jake Morrison betrayed me for bounty money, left me to die in the desert, and now he's here to make sure I can't testify against him when the law finally catches up. He knows I can identify him as a murderer, which makes me a liability he can't afford to ignore." His explanation was clinical, but Marguerite could hear the pain beneath his professional assessment. The approaching riders had stopped just outside rifle range, obviously discussing strategy while they studied the ranch house and outbuildings for signs of defensive preparation. Morrison raised a white cloth on a stick, the universal signal for parley, but Gabriel knew it was just another form of tactical maneuvering. "He wants to talk," Gabriel said grimly, "which means he's hoping to get close enough to finish this without a prolonged fight. But men like Morrison don't honor flags of truce when it's inconvenient." As the three killers began their careful approach toward the house, Gabriel and Marguerite prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether their growing love had any chance of surviving the violent world that had finally followed him home. Morrison dismounted 50 yards from the house, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as a man who'd prospered since his betrayal of Gabriel. The two gunmen who'd accompanied him remained mounted, their rifles ready, but not obviously threatening as they maintained the pretense of peaceful negotiation. Morrison's smile was the same one Gabriel remembered from their partnership, charming, apparently sincere, and completely without genuine warmth or honor behind it. "Gabriel, my old friend," Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered yard. "I heard you'd survived our little misunderstanding in the desert. I'm glad. It gives us a chance to settle our differences like civilized men instead of letting old grievances fester into something uglier." His words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable to any witnesses while containing threats that Gabriel would understand perfectly. Gabriel emerged from the house with his hands visible but close to his weapons, every instinct screaming that this was a trap designed to get him into the open where Morrison's hired guns could kill him without risk. "Funny way of showing friendship, Jake," he replied, his voice carrying across the yard with deadly calm. "Leaving a man to die in the desert doesn't usually lead to civilized conversations later. What do you really want here?" Morrison's expression shifted subtly, the mask of false friendship slipping just enough to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "I want to make sure we understand each other about recent events. There are people who might misinterpret what happened between us, and I'd hate for wild stories to damage both our reputations. Perhaps we could discuss this privately without involving innocent bystanders who might get hurt if tempers run too high." The threat to Marguerite was implicit but unmistakable. Marguerite appeared in the doorway behind Gabriel, her rifle held with obvious competence, while her eyes studied the three men with the careful attention of someone evaluating dangerous animals. Her presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison had expected to face a wounded man alone, not a partnership that could complicate his plans considerably. "Gentlemen," she said with deceptive politeness, "you're welcome to state your business from where you stand. This is my property, and I don't allow armed strangers any closer to my home." Her words carried the authority of someone defending her own land, transforming what Morrison had intended as a simple execution into a more complex situation that could easily spiral beyond his control. Morrison's mask finally dropped completely as he realized his careful plan was falling apart in the face of unexpected resistance. "This doesn't concern you, woman," he snarled, his voice losing all pretense of civility. "Gabriel's got something that belongs to me, and I mean to collect it one way or another. You can hand him over peaceful-like, or you can get hurt when we take him by force. Your choice, but either way, he's coming with us." His ultimatum was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted through intimidation and violence. Gabriel stepped protectively in front of Marguerite, his movement triggering an immediate response from Morrison's hired guns, who raised their rifles with practiced precision. The parley was over, and everyone present understood that the next few moments would determine who lived and who died in the snow outside a small ranch house that had become the center of a deadly confrontation. "The only thing I've got that belongs to you, Jake, is a bullet with your name on it," Gabriel replied, his voice carrying the finality of a man who'd made his peace with violence. But Morrison's next words revealed depths of betrayal that went beyond their personal partnership, exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial law enforcement. "You think this is about money?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "This is about you being too damn honest for your own good, Gabriel. You would have figured out eventually that half the bounties we collected were paid by people who wanted their enemies dead, not brought to justice. You would have realized that we were assassins disguised as lawmen, and your conscience would have made you a liability to everyone involved." The revelation hit Gabriel like a physical blow, recontextualizing years of partnership and dozens of successful hunts that he'd thought were serving justice. Morrison was confessing to a conspiracy that had used bounty hunters as cover for contract killings, turning the legal system itself into a weapon for eliminating inconvenient people. Gabriel's reputation for honesty and competence had made him the perfect, unwitting accomplice, while Morrison's greed and lack of scruples had made him a willing participant in systematic murder. "Judge Garrett, Sheriff Williams, Marshal Thompson, they all sent us after men who knew too much about their business dealings," Morrison continued, seeming to enjoy Gabriel's obvious shock and pain. "You brought them in alive just like you always did, but they never made it to trial. Amazing how many prisoners try to escape custody and get shot for their troubles." His admission of conspiracy and murder was delivered with casual pride, as if he was boasting about particularly clever business practices rather than confessing to crimes that had subverted justice throughout the territory. As the full scope of his unwitting participation in corruption became clear, Gabriel realized that his entire career as a bounty hunter had been built on lies, and the knowledge threatened to destroy everything he'd believed about himself and his profession. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, shattering the morning quiet as 6 weapons spoke almost simultaneously. Gabriel's first shot took down Morrison's left-hand gun, while Marguerite's rifle barked from the doorway, her bullet catching the second hired killer in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. Morrison himself dove for cover behind his horse, firing wildly as he tried to reach a position where he could coordinate his surviving man's attack on the house. Gabriel moved with the fluid precision of someone whose life had depended on such skills for 8 years, rolling behind the water trough while bullets splintered wood and rang off metal around him. His return fire was carefully aimed and devastatingly effective, each shot designed to keep Morrison's forces pinned down while Marguerite provided covering fire from the house. They worked together with surprising coordination, their partnership extending naturally from ranch work to combat. The battle became a deadly game of position and patience, with both sides seeking advantages that could break the stalemate without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Morrison's remaining gunmen tried to flank the house through the barn, but Marguerite had anticipated the maneuver and was waiting with her rifle when he appeared in the doorway. Her shot was true, and the hired killer crumpled to the ground with a bullet through his heart, leaving Morrison alone against two determined defenders. Desperation made Morrison dangerous in new ways, and he began firing at the house itself rather than specific targets, his bullets shattering windows and splintering door frames in an attempt to force his enemies into the open. One of his wild shots grazed Marguerite's arm, drawing blood and a cry of pain that filled Gabriel with rage beyond anything he'd experienced during his years of tracking criminals. This had become personal in ways that transcended professional obligation or legal duty. "It's over, Jake!" Gabriel called out, rising from cover with his gun trained on Morrison's position. "Your men are dead, you're alone, and the woman you just shot is tougher than you'll ever be. Surrender now, and I'll let the law decide what happens to you. Keep fighting, and I'll finish what you started in the desert." His offer was genuine, but both men knew Morrison was too deeply involved in territorial corruption to ever survive a legal trial. The confrontation could only end one way, and Morrison's decision to raise his gun for a final shot sealed his fate with the finality of a judge's gavel. Gabriel's bullet caught Morrison's center mass, spinning the corrupt bounty hunter around before dropping him face first into the snow that quickly began turning red beneath his dying body. The man who'd betrayed their partnership, stolen their bounty money, and left Gabriel to die in the desert now lay breathing his last in the yard of the woman whose love had given his life new meaning. Justice had been served, but Gabriel felt no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim completion of business that should never have been necessary. Marguerite emerged from the house with her wounded arm bound in cloth torn from her petticoat, her rifle still ready despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. She studied Morrison's body with the dispassionate attention of someone who'd learned to deal with death as a practical matter rather than an emotional crisis. "Is it finished?" she asked quietly, her question carrying hope that this confrontation had ended the threat to their peaceful life together. Gabriel knelt beside Morrison's body, searching through pockets that yielded evidence of corruption reaching far beyond what he'd imagined possible. Letters from territorial officials, lists of names marked for assassination, and account books showing payments for murders disguised as legal bounty hunting revealed a conspiracy that had subverted justice throughout the region. The papers were enough to expose and destroy the network Morrison had served, but they also made Gabriel and Marguerite targets for anyone else involved in the scheme. "It's just beginning," Gabriel said grimly as he studied documents that named judges, sheriffs, and federal marshals as participants in systematic murder for hire. Morrison was just one piece of something much bigger, and now that he's dead, the people who paid him will want to eliminate anyone who can connect them to his crimes. These papers make us the most dangerous people in the territory because we can prove that half the law enforcement establishment is corrupt. His discovery of the conspiracy's scope meant their victory over Morrison was actually just the first battle in a war they hadn't known they were fighting. Marguerite read over his shoulder, her face growing pale as she understood the implications of what they'd uncovered. Men she'd trusted, officials she'd respected, law enforcement officers she'd thought were protecting honest citizens, all of them were revealed as participants in a criminal enterprise that had made a mockery of territorial justice. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "Who can we trust with evidence like this when the corruption reaches so deep into the government itself?" Gabriel looked up from the damning papers to meet her eyes, seeing in them the same determination that had saved his life and given him something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. "We trust each other," he said simply. "And we find someone in federal authority who isn't part of this conspiracy. It won't be easy and it won't be safe, but it's the only way to honor the memory of everyone who died because of these bastards' greed." As snow began falling again, covering Morrison's body and the blood that marked their yard as a battlefield, Gabriel and Marguerite understood that their love had been forged in violence and would be tested by forces that wanted them dead for knowing too much truth. 3 days after the gunfight, a lone rider approached the ranch flying a flag that bore the eagle emblem of federal authority. Colonel Samuel Beauregard dismounted with the careful movements of a career soldier, his weathered face showing intelligence and integrity that marked him as someone who'd earned his rank through competence rather than political connections. Gabriel kept his weapons ready but made no threatening moves as the federal officer approached under what appeared to be a genuine flag of truce. "Mr. Moreau," Colonel Beauregard said formally, "I'm investigating the disappearance of Federal Marshal Morrison and his associates. Local authorities report gunfire at this location, and I need to understand exactly what happened here." His tone was professional but not hostile, suggesting someone who was seeking truth rather than predetermined conclusions. The use of Morrison's false title suggested either ignorance of the man's true nature or a test of Gabriel's willingness to reveal what he knew. Gabriel made a decision that would define the rest of their lives, choosing to trust this federal officer with the truth rather than attempting to hide evidence that could destroy them if discovered later. "Morrison wasn't a federal marshal," he said bluntly, producing the papers they'd found on the dead man's body. "He was a corrupt bounty hunter working for territorial officials who used our profession as cover for contract killings. These documents prove that judges, sheriffs, and federal marshals throughout the territory have been ordering assassinations disguised as legal bounty hunting." Colonel Beauregard's expression shifted from professional skepticism to shocked attention as he examined the evidence, his trained eye recognizing the authenticity of documents that revealed corruption beyond anything he'd suspected. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, studying letters that implicated men he'd worked with and trusted. "If this is genuine, then we're dealing with a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. No wonder our investigations into missing persons and suspicious deaths have been hitting dead ends. Half the people we've been working with are part of the problem." The colonel's reaction convinced both Gabriel and Marguerite that they'd found someone who could be trusted with the explosive evidence they'd uncovered. Beauregard was clearly horrified by the scope of corruption revealed in Morrison's papers, and his immediate understanding of the implications suggested someone with both the authority and integrity needed to pursue justice against powerful enemies. "What do you need from us?" Marguerite asked, stepping forward with the calm courage that had sustained her through every crisis she'd faced. "And what kind of protection can you offer against people who've already tried to kill us once?" Her questions were practical and immediate, focusing on the realities they would face if they chose to become witnesses against a criminal conspiracy that had the resources and connections to eliminate inconvenient problems. Colonel Beauregard's investigation moved with military efficiency once he understood the scope of corruption they were facing. Federal agents who could be trusted were quietly brought in from other territories, while suspects were placed under discreet surveillance that would prevent them from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses. The conspiracy Morrison had served was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, with roots reaching into Washington itself and tentacles that controlled territorial politics through systematic intimidation and murder. Gabriel found himself working as an unofficial consultant to the federal investigation, his knowledge of bounty hunting practices and territorial criminal networks proving invaluable in understanding how the conspiracy had operated. Each name in Morrison's records led to other names. Each connection revealed new layers of corruption, and each revelation made it clearer that cleaning up the territory would require nothing less than complete replacement of most law enforcement officials. Marguerite's ranch became the unofficial headquarters for the investigation. Its isolation providing security, while its location allowed easy communication with federal agents operating throughout the territory. She found herself managing logistics and communications with the same efficiency she'd brought to ranch work, her intelligence and organizational skills making her an invaluable partner in the effort to bring justice to a corrupt system. The evidence they'd uncovered was devastating in its completeness. Morrison had kept meticulous records of every assassination, every bribe, every official who'd participated in the conspiracy. His paranoia about being betrayed by his Confederates had led him to document everything, creating an archive that could destroy dozens of careers and send scores of corrupt officials to prison. But the same thoroughness that made the evidence valuable also made it dangerous, because anyone exposed by Morrison's records would have powerful incentives to eliminate the witnesses who could testify about its authenticity. As the investigation progressed and arrests began, Gabriel and Marguerite realized that their quiet life together was over forever. They'd become central figures in a legal proceeding that would reshape territorial politics. Key witnesses whose testimony could determine the fates of some of the most powerful men in the region. Their love had survived betrayal, violence, and corruption, but now it would be tested by fame, responsibility, and the kind of public scrutiny that could destroy relationships that couldn't withstand external pressure. The widow who'd saved a dying bounty hunter and the man who'd found redemption through her love were about to discover whether their partnership was strong enough to survive the consequences of doing the right thing in a world where justice came with a price that few were willing to pay. The first assassination attempt came at dawn 3 weeks after Colonel Beauregard's investigation had begun making arrests throughout the territory. Gabriel spotted the gunman's muzzle flash from the ridge overlooking their ranch just in time to tackle Marguerite to the ground as bullets shattered the kitchen windows where they'd been having breakfast. The sniper was professional, patient, and obviously well-informed about their daily routines, qualities that marked him as someone hired by people with substantial resources and detailed intelligence about federal operations. The siege that followed lasted 6 hours, with Gabriel and Marguerite trapped in their own home while multiple attackers tried to find angles that would allow them to complete their assassination mission. Federal agents who'd been stationed nearby for protection arrived within an hour, but the killers had chosen their positions well, creating a standoff that could only be resolved through patient tactical maneuvering that risked civilian casualties if anything went wrong. When the shooting finally stopped, 4 bodies lay scattered around the ranch property. Professional killers whose equipment and methods suggested military training and substantial financial backing. Colonel Beauregard's investigation of the dead men revealed connections to private security companies that served wealthy clients throughout the Western territories, making it clear that the conspiracy was fighting back with resources that exceeded anything local law enforcement could provide. This was just the beginning, Colonel Beauregard warned, as federal agents secured the ranch and began planning additional protection for Gabriel and Marguerite. The people we're investigating have enough money to hire an army of killers, and they understand that eliminating key witnesses is cheaper than facing trial for conspiracy and murder. Your testimony is crucial to our case, but it's also what makes you the most dangerous people in the territory to anyone involved in this corruption. The reality of their situation was stark and unforgiving. They could either abandon the investigation and flee to somewhere the conspiracy couldn't reach them, or they could continue fighting for justice while accepting that every day might be their last. The choice was complicated by the growing certainty that running wouldn't actually save them, because people who'd ordered the systematic murder of territorial officials wouldn't hesitate to hunt down witnesses wherever they tried to hide. Their only real hope for survival lay in completing the investigation and ensuring that everyone involved in the conspiracy was either dead or in prison, where they couldn't order additional killings. As Gabriel and Marguerite held each other in the ruins of their bullet-riddled home, they understood that love alone wouldn't be enough to survive what was coming. They would need courage, luck, and help from forces beyond their control if they hoped to live long enough to see justice served. Colonel Beauregard's solution to their security problem was as ingenious as it was dangerous. Instead of trying to protect Gabriel and Marguerite in one location, he would keep them moving through a network of safe houses operated by federal agents and trusted allies throughout the territory. The plan required them to abandon everything they'd built together, living like fugitives while the investigation proceeded and arrests continued. But it also meant survival in a situation where stationary targets were simply waiting to be killed by professional assassins. Their first safe house was a cabin in the mountains operated by a retired federal marshal who understood the stakes involved and the price of failure. Samuel Crowfeather was half Cherokee, half Irish, and completely committed to the cause of justice for people who'd been failed by corrupt officials. His knowledge of wilderness survival and guerrilla warfare tactics had been earned fighting cavalry units that served corrupt territorial interests, making him the perfect protector for witnesses whose lives depended on staying hidden from powerful enemies. The weeks they spent moving from safe house to safe house tested Gabriel and Marguerite's relationship in ways that ranch life never had. Living in constant danger, never staying anywhere long enough to feel secure, depending on strangers for their safety, all of this created stress that could destroy partnerships built on less solid foundations. But instead of driving them apart, the shared hardship seemed to strengthen their bond. Each crisis they survived together, proving that their love could endure anything the world threw at them. Gabriel's bounty hunting skills proved invaluable during their time underground. His ability to read terrain and anticipate danger, keeping them alive when pursuit got too close. Marguerite's frontier experience served them equally well. Her knowledge of practical survival and her ability to appear harmless when necessary, allowing them to blend into communities where strangers might otherwise attract unwanted attention. They were learning to function as a team in ways that went beyond romantic partnership or professional collaboration. The investigation continued around them, with Colonel Beauregard providing updates through coded messages that revealed the scope of their success. Dozens of corrupt officials had been arrested, conspiracy networks had been disrupted throughout the territory, and the systematic murder-for-hire scheme that had subverted justice for years was finally being exposed. But each success also brought new dangers, as surviving conspirators grew increasingly desperate to eliminate the witnesses whose testimony could complete their destruction. Gabriel and Marguerite were winning their war against corruption, but victory was still months away. And they weren't certain they could survive long enough to testify at the trials that would determine whether justice or revenge would define the territory's future. Morrison's former business partners had grown tired of failed assassination attempts and decided to handle the Gabriel problem personally, bringing together the most dangerous killers money could buy for a concentrated effort that would either eliminate the key witnesses or die trying. The hunting party that tracked them to their latest safe house included men whose reputations had been earned in Indian wars, border conflicts, and criminal enterprises throughout the West. Professional killers who'd never failed to complete a mission when properly motivated by money and threats. Gabriel and Marguerite's position became hopeless when their safe house was surrounded by 8 men who knew their business and had been given unlimited resources to complete their assignment. Samuel Crowfeather's mountain cabin was defensible, but not against sustained assault by experienced fighters who were willing to accept casualties to achieve their objective. The siege began at sunset and would end with either the death of everyone inside the cabin or the elimination of the hunting party. There was no middle ground possible when both sides understood that defeat meant death. The battle was unlike anything Gabriel had experienced during his years as a bounty hunter, a sustained firefight where survival depended more on endurance and ammunition management than individual marksmanship. The attackers had supplies and manpower that allowed them to maintain pressure indefinitely, while the defenders were limited by what they'd brought to the cabin and what they could scavenge from their enemies' bodies. Each hour that passed brought them closer to the moment when their ammunition would run out and the siege would become a massacre. Marguerite proved her worth as a fighter during the longest night of their lives, her rifle accounting for 2 of the attackers, while her steady nerves kept panic from destroying their carefully coordinated defense. Samuel Crow Feather fought with the skill and fury of a man defending his own land, his knowledge of the cabin's approaches allowing him to anticipate enemy movements and position his limited forces for maximum effectiveness. But Gabriel understood that courage and skill wouldn't be enough against odds that were getting worse with each passing hour. The dawn attack that should have finished them was disrupted by the arrival of Colonel Beauregard's federal agents who'd been tracking the hunting party and timed their intervention for maximum effect. The 6-hour battle that followed turned the mountain wilderness into a killing ground where justice and corruption fought their final confrontation with weapons that spoke in thunder and smoke. When the shooting finally stopped, the conspiracy's last attempt to escape legal judgment lay dead in the snow around a cabin that had become a fortress for people who refused to let evil triumph through intimidation and murder. Gabriel and Marguerite had survived their final test, but the victory had been bought with blood and sacrifice that would mark them forever as survivors of a war most people would never understand. The federal courthouse in Denver became the center of national attention as the trials began for what newspapers called the territorial conspiracy, a criminal enterprise that had subverted justice throughout the American West through systematic assassination and corruption. Gabriel and Marguerite found themselves thrust into public spotlight that made their previous anonymity seem like a luxury they'd never fully appreciated. Their love story became secondary to their role as key witnesses, but the strength of their partnership was evident to everyone who watched them testify about corruption that had reached the highest levels of territorial government. Gabriel's testimony was devastating in its detail and credibility, his reputation as an honest bounty hunter lending weight to accusations that might have seemed incredible coming from less reliable sources. He described years of unwitting participation in a murder scheme that had used legitimate law enforcement as cover for contract killings, his obvious pain at being deceived, making his words more convincing than any prosecutorial argument could have been. The courtroom sat in shocked silence as he revealed how territorial officials had perverted justice for personal gain. Marguerite's testimony focused on the evidence they'd discovered and the attempts made to silence them. Her calm recitation of assassination attempts and systematic intimidation, revealing the lengths to which corrupt officials had gone to protect their criminal enterprise. Her dignity under hostile cross-examination impressed observers who'd expected frontier women to be easily rattled by aggressive legal tactics, and her intelligence was obvious to everyone who heard her precise, detailed answers to complex questions about conspiracy and murder. The trials lasted 6 months, with dozens of defendants ranging from territorial judges to federal marshals facing charges that included conspiracy, murder, bribery, and treason. The evidence Morrison had kept was supplemented by testimony from other witnesses who'd been afraid to come forward until federal protection made cooperation possible. The scope of corruption revealed during the proceedings shocked even experienced legal observers who thought they'd seen everything the frontier could produce. The convictions that followed sent a clear message throughout the West that federal authority would not tolerate systematic subversion of territorial law enforcement. Most defendants received sentences ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment, while a few who'd cooperated with the investigation were given reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony against higher-ranking conspirators. The territorial government was essentially rebuilt from the ground up, with new officials chosen for their integrity rather than their political connections or willingness to participate in corrupt schemes. The aftermath of the trials left Gabriel and Marguerite famous throughout the territory as the couple whose courage had exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Their testimony had been crucial to convicting dozens of corrupt officials, but fame brought new complications to lives that had been built around privacy and self-reliance. Offers poured in from newspapers wanting their story, book publishers seeking to capitalize on their adventures, and politicians hoping to associate themselves with heroes who'd risked everything for justice. Gabriel struggled with his new reputation as a hero when he still felt guilt over his years of unwitting participation in the conspiracy's murder scheme. The fact that he'd been deceived rather than complicit didn't ease his conscience about the men he'd brought in who'd been killed before they could reach trial. Marguerite's love and understanding helped him work through emotions that might have destroyed a weaker man, but the healing process was slow and sometimes painful for both of them. The financial rewards that came with their fame provided opportunities they'd never imagined possible. Gabriel was offered positions in federal law enforcement that would have made him wealthy and powerful, while Marguerite received proposals from business investors who wanted to capitalize on her reputation and intelligence. But both found themselves more interested in rebuilding the simple life they'd shared before corruption and violence had made them public figures. They decided to use their fame and resources to help other victims of the conspiracy, establishing a foundation that provided legal assistance and financial support to families whose breadwinners had been murdered by corrupt officials. The work was personally meaningful and socially valuable, allowing them to transform their traumatic experiences into something that could help heal the damage corruption had inflicted on innocent people throughout the territory. Their ranch became a symbol of successful resistance to corruption, visited by federal officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens who wanted to see where two people had decided to fight back against seemingly impossible odds. The bullet holes in their house were preserved as reminders of the price of justice, while the improvements they'd made together demonstrated what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. Their love story had become part of territorial legend, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for lives dedicated to preventing the kind of systematic injustice they'd helped expose and destroy. The final threat to their happiness came not from enemies seeking revenge, but from Gabriel's own past, when a woman arrived at their ranch claiming to be the widow of one of the men he'd brought to justice years earlier. Elena Vasquez was beautiful, desperate, and carrying news that threatened to destroy everything Gabriel and Marguerite had built together. Her husband had been innocent of the crimes for which he'd been executed, and she had proof that he'd been framed by the same conspiracy they'd helped destroy. Gabriel's world shattered as Elena presented evidence that Juan Vasquez had been an honest sheriff who'd been getting too close to exposing territorial corruption when he was framed for murder and marked for assassination. Gabriel had tracked him down with his usual skill and professionalism, bringing him in alive as always, only to learn later that Vasquez had been killed while attempting to escape from federal custody. The revelation that he'd been instrumental in the death of an innocent man opened wounds that had never properly healed. Marguerite watched the man she loved struggle with guilt that threatened to consume him, understanding that Elena's news had reopened questions about justice, morality, and personal responsibility that had no easy answers. Gabriel had spent years believing he served justice by bringing criminals to face legal consequences, but the conspiracy had perverted his good intentions, using his skills and reputation to eliminate people who threatened their corrupt schemes. The knowledge that he'd been a weapon in innocent hands was almost unbearable. Elena's demands for justice seemed reasonable at first. She wanted Gabriel to testify about the circumstances of her husband's capture, providing evidence that could clear his name posthumously and allow her to collect compensation from federal authorities. But her real agenda was darker and more personal, seeking revenge against the man who'd brought her husband to his death, regardless of whether Gabriel had known about the conspiracy that had manipulated him. Her pain was genuine, but it was driving her toward actions that would destroy more innocent lives. The confrontation that had been building since Elena's arrival finally exploded when she revealed that she'd brought allies, men who'd lost family members to the conspiracy and were seeking revenge against anyone they held responsible for their suffering. Gabriel found himself facing the same choice that had defined his entire adult life: stand and fight for what he believed was right, or run from consequences that weren't entirely his fault, but which he couldn't entirely escape either. As armed men surrounded the ranch house where he'd found love and redemption, Gabriel realized that some debts could only be paid in blood, regardless of whether the debtor was truly guilty of the crimes for which payment was demanded. The standoff that would determine their future lasted through the longest night of Gabriel and Marguerite's lives, with Elena's grief-driven vigilantes demanding justice that looked remarkably like revenge. Gabriel stood in the yard where he'd once killed Morrison, facing men whose pain he understood even as he prepared to fight them. Knowing that survival might require adding more deaths to a conscience already burdened beyond what any reasonable person should have to bear. But Marguerite's love had taught him that some things were worth dying for, and their life together had become one of those things. The breakthrough came when Colonel Beauregard arrived with federal documentation that proved Juan Vasquez had indeed been an undercover federal agent investigating territorial corruption when he was framed and killed. The evidence transformed Elena's husband from innocent victim to fallen hero, making her quest for revenge against Gabriel seem both misguided and cruel. More importantly, it revealed that Vasquez had been working to expose the same conspiracy that Gabriel and Marguerite had ultimately destroyed, making them allies rather than enemies in the fight for justice. Elena's reaction to learning the truth about her husband's mission was heartbreaking to witness. Years of misdirected anger and grief collapsed into tears that seemed to wash away the hatred that had driven her across the territory seeking vengeance. Gabriel knelt beside her in the dust, offering comfort to a woman whose pain mirrored his own guilt, understanding that they were both victims of a system that had perverted justice for criminal purposes. Her forgiveness, when it finally came, lifted a weight from his soul that had been crushing him since her arrival. The federal compensation that Elena received for her husband's service and death was substantial enough to rebuild her life, while the official recognition of Juan Vasquez's heroism cleared his name and established his legacy as one of the territorial agents who died fighting corruption. Gabriel's role in bringing Vasquez to his death was officially recognized as unwitting service to federal law enforcement, absolving him of legal responsibility while acknowledging the moral complexity of his situation. Justice had been served, but more importantly, healing had begun for everyone wounded by the conspiracy's crimes. 6 months later, Gabriel and Marguerite stood together at the altar of the small church in Redemption Creek, surrounded by friends who'd stood with them through every crisis and challenge they'd faced. Their wedding was both celebration and culmination, marking not just their love for each other but their victory over forces that had tried to destroy everything good and decent about frontier life. Colonel Beauregard served as Gabriel's best man, while Elena stood as Marguerite's matron of honor, their presence symbolizing the transformation of enemies into family through shared commitment to justice and healing. As they exchanged vows that promised partnership through whatever challenges the future might bring, Gabriel and Marguerite understood that their love had been tested by everything the world could throw at them and had emerged stronger, deeper, and more precious than either had thought possible. The bounty hunter who'd been left to die in the desert had found redemption through a widow's courage, while the woman who'd lost everything had discovered that saving someone else's life could restore meaning to her own. Their story would be told for generations as proof that love could indeed triumph over hatred, that justice could prevail over corruption, and that two people who chose to stand together could change the world around them through nothing more complicated than refusing to surrender to despair. They'd found their forever in each other's arms, and no force on earth could take that away from them now.